I'm gonna start one. Ready, you guys? Everybody okay out there? 1, 2, 3. Hi, welcome everybody. Nice to see you all out there. And we have a good group of attendants tonight for Mark Foster Gage here at the Cal Poly LA Metro program. I'm going to begin by introducing Angela Anthony, who is management at the Helms Bakery District Design Center, where we typically run our lectures, and she's one of our sponsors. So Angela.
Hi everyone, welcome. I'm so happy to see you all here. Looks like we have a full house, huh, Stephen? So behind me is the Helms Design Center, where we typically host these events. This is a previous Cal Poly LA Metro event. Thank you, Evan, for the wonderful background. And so thanks, Mark, for being here. I wish we could host you personally. We usually do a pretty fun little reception. For those of you who don't know anything about Helms, it was an actual working bakery built in 1931. They delivered baked goods throughout Los Angeles, and it was pretty innovative. And it's that sort of spirit of innovation that we continue at Helms. The current owners really preserve this landmark building, and it's a pretty successful adaptive reuse. I think it's beautifully done. Restaurants, specialty shops, a design hub, which is the design center, and then we host events that are all based on architecture and design. So you can sign up for the newsletter if you like. I promise not to spam you. And Stephen and I have been doing this for several years. I don't know, we're probably on our 7th year now, and it just is fun every year. So welcome and enjoy the evening, everyone. I'll go back to you, Stephen.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and thank you all for attending tonight. So my name is Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly Los Angeles Metropolitan Program in Architecture and Urban Design. We are an off-campus program for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in Los Angeles. We have about 30 plus students who come down to LA during the school year, where they take studio and they intern in offices, and they have history theory classes, and we have about 5 other faculty. I think Pavel Getop is here with us this evening, as well as a bunch of other great people who are teaching the program. We've been running for about 10 years, and we run a lecture series, and we have been at the Helms District Design Center, but also sometimes the A+D Museum, and we've done some events at Storefront in New York as well. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to announce, of course, our wonderful sponsors who assist our program in many, many ways with a series of fellowships and scholarships, and also through media and event series sponsorship. So of course, Helms Bakery District, HMC Architects, Morphosis Architects, Geary and Partners, AC Martin, Co-Architects, Marmol Radziner, Theater DNA, Bulltaup, Art Document Solutions, and our media sponsors, LAAIA, ArtConnect, and KCRW DNA. So tonight we have, going to be, I hope, a fantastic lecture by Mark Foster Gage. Been hoping to get him to give a talk with us for a while. Definitely we're fans of his very provocative work. Mark Foster Gage, of course, is an architect and theorist with expertise in the relationship between aesthetics theory and design. Since about 2002, his New York City firm, Mark Foster Gage Architects, has combined the assets of a fully licensed architectural firm with the use of emerging technologies for clients such as Lady Gaga, Intel, Google, Diesel, W Hotels, Samsung, and the Coachella Music Festival. Gage's work has been exhibited in museums internationally, including the Museum of Modern Art MoMA, the Museum of Art Institute of Chicago, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the National Gallery of Art in Osaka, the Hiroshima Museum of Contemporary Art, the Frack Center in Orleans, and the Niigata Art Museum, the Museum of Modern Art in Saitama, and the Franz Mayer Museum in Mexico City, and the Venice, Beijing, and Prague Biennales. His work has been featured in most major architectural publications as well, including Vogue, Fast Company, Wired, USA Today, the New York Times, Vice, Surface, 25-page feature in A+U, and he's also been on PBS, Fox, and MTV. Gage's work is the subject of 2 monographs, Mark Foster Gage, Projects and Provocations from Rizzoli, 2018, and Thought Through Form, the work of Mark Foster Gage, Tongji, 2020. He authored the book Designing Social Equality, Architecture Aesthetics and the Perception of Democracy, Routledge, 2018. And he has edited 3 additional books, Aesthetics Equals Politics, New Discourses Across Art, Architecture and Philosophy, MIT, 2019, Aesthetic Theory, Essential Text, Norton 2012, and Composite Surface Software, High Performance Architecture with Greg Lynn from Yale in 2009. Gage has also written extensively for academic journals and other publications, including CNN, JAE, Volume, Fulcrum, A+U, Perspecta, AD, Oz, Platt, Moll, the Routledge Handbook of Architectural Design, and of course, Log, where he was the guest editor of issue number 17. Gage has served on the board of directors for McDowell Colony and was recently a nominee for the Architecture Prize awarded by the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Before I turn it over to Mark, I just also want to say we'll have a Q&A. It'll be live at the end. You're welcome to put your questions up ahead of time, or also just raise your hand and we'll add you into the conversation when we get there. So with no further ado, Mark Foster Gage. Go for it.
All right, Stephen. Well, thank you so much for arranging this. It's nice to do these kind of things and reconnect with people as we're all isolated. I see all of you have backgrounds from my various projects, which I think is amazing because it looks like they were actually built and you guys are enjoying the insides of them. So you'll have to let me know how it feels to be inside one of my projects because I just don't know. So few have actually been constructed. But thank you guys for taking the time for the invitation, and thanks to the, I don't know, it looks like 160 or so attendees that are also watching this. I'm touched, but it's also, I think, a sign as to just how bored we are in the COVID world, that architecture lectures become our recreation. This started at a perfect time. It just turned 7 o'clock here in New York, and everybody was banging on their pots and pans outside my window, and it sounded like they were cheering me on. So I'm particularly energized and ready to go. You know, the tricky thing about Zoom lectures is when you make a joke, you don't hear anyone laughing back, so you just feel stupid. You know, I'll get a laugh track on the next time I do this. But all right, so I'm going to share my screen here. Stephen, you'll be my canary and let me know if anything isn't working properly.
And no worries.
All right.
Pardon to interrupt. I don't think the record is on.
Is that something on your end, Stephen? Ah, there we go. All right, I'm being recorded. I'll officially be on my best behavior from here on out. See, no laughter. All right, so today I thought I would take you through a couple of different, I don't know, like there's different parts of my brain working on different things at different times. Some of them are stupid, some of them are interesting, and I decided to kind of give you a mix and let you decide which is which. One of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot recently in terms of architectural theory and how we position architecture in the world is what's represented by this graph, which shows how essentially within the last few years, the world flipped. And for the first time in human history, more humans live in cities and urban environments than live in rural environments. And I think this is significant in architecture, not only because architects are oftentimes involved in the design of cities, but I think it's significant ontologically and existentially, because I think it promises to rewrite what the architectural profession is defined as. So for the past 50,000 years that, let's say, architecture has been built, or at least since Periclean Greece in 400 BC, where we get the term architect, where archi is master and tecton is builder. The master builder started building things around 2,500 years ago. Architecture has always been this thing that exists in nature and protects you from the environment. It's, in a sense, our way of existing on this planet, protecting ourselves from everything from predators to weather. And in that way, it's always been an isolated individual object within a context of something else. What this graph represents is that that's flipped. Architecture is now the substance that we live in as a majority, and the stuff outside, which we used to call nature, is now a lesser percentage of what used to define our lives. So how I like to phrase this is, if any time in the last 2,000 to 50,000 years you would have asked what the architectural discipline is responsible for, you would have said architects are responsible for building the shelters that protect us from the environment. Now, because more of our lives are being defined entirely by architecture, I think that needs to be reconsidered. So if you ask me what an architect does today, I would probably say something like architecture is the discipline responsible for designing and building the backdrop of reality. So human reality is increasingly taking place in cities, which means humans' reality is increasingly being defined by architecture. And that's a big jump from something that just protects you from the elements to something that defines your very reality. In a sense, architecture is our new nature, not in the sense that it is leafy and green with wild animals, but in the sense that it is the thing in which we are embedded as a species, at least as of 2016, as a majority. And all trends point towards that trajectory continuing as humans move more and more into cities. So hold that in your mind for a moment. Architecture somehow being related to the production of the backdrop of our reality, not just providing shelter. The second aspect of that I want to talk about is a more philosophical aspect, a more ontological aspect, which is, what exactly do we know about our reality? And I use this image because I think it's kind of telling. I'm a little bit nerdy when it comes to like physics and astronomy and stuff like this. So I know you've all seen this in your high school physics classes, but it's the electromagnetic spectrum. It shows in the colored part where humans are capable of seeing, right? So in this entire framework of at least the electromagnetic spectrum, we see this much of it. One way of reading this is just as electromagnetic radiation. Another way, sort of metaphorically, is reading it as what kind of access we have to the reality of the universe that we live in. We are only capable of accessing with our senses this amount of stuff, right, in here. Maybe, I don't know, 1/1000th or 1/100th of the entire spectrum. And what's crazy about this, how we see things, at least I'm going to describe it in terms of colors here, that are referred to a larger idea: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, dark blue, indigo slash purple or violet. What's interesting is the more you learn about humans' understanding of reality, which is ontology, the philosophy of being, is that the more we think we know about reality, the less we realize we know about reality. So my interest has always been in philosophies that address not the aspects of reality that are known, but the aspects of reality which are unknown. And I think this is what produces curiosity in humans. And I think it's also essentially what we describe as aesthetics today, the relationship to the things we know and the relationship to the things we don't know. So why do I talk about all this with regards to architecture? First of all, like, as you all sit in front of your desks and I'm in front of this desk, you should know, you probably don't, but you may, it's not something that you see occasionally, other than an occasional TED Talk. But for instance, these colors that the human eye sees in and the brain interprets don't actually exist in reality. So there is no color red in reality. As far as neuroscientists can discern, walking through our reality is much more like walking through how your Rhino models look before you render them, everything being a kind of mute, colorless gray. Now, there's an evolutionary advantage in being able to distinguish different qualities of different things in reality. And what the brain does is it imposes these colors on certain things which share certain characteristics. So that is to say, an apple is not red. An apple is, we don't know what it is, but let's say for now, some sort of gray. Your mind applies the concept of red to the apple in order to distinguish it from an orange. So already, even our very apparatus through which we understand reality, we realize to be, in some sense, an entire fiction that our minds developed evolutionarily to make sense of the world for us. There's a lot of writing about this, about how the mind is actually some sort of machine that converts real reality into a virtual reality. Now, I find this fascinating because it's the philosophical aspect of reality. When you combine that with the last slide, which is the fact that architecture is increasingly becoming a discipline involved with the defining of reality, these two things put together make for an unusual moment in philosophical and architectural history. This is why I collaborate with and am involved with a number of philosophers. Probably the one I'm most known for is an association with Graham Harman and his philosophy of object-oriented ontology, which is an offshoot of speculative realism. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I've been working with Graham Harman's work intellectually for about the last 5 or 6 years. We've subsequently become friends. I just traded emails with him the other day. The other semester, not last semester, but the previous semester, I've been on the faculty at Yale for about 20 years and was able to get him to co-teach an advanced studio with me, where we thought about this relationship between philosophy and architecture. And we developed a studio around the architecture of thought, how we think about architecture as a place to think, but also how the mind and the architecture of the mind is designed to produce the human thing, which we call consciousness. So Graham and I taught this studio. We took all of our students to Tibet for about a week to look at historic Buddhist monasteries as probably the spaces in the world most intensely dedicated to human thinking. So this was a way to try to bridge our two disciplines. And this on the right is an image of all of our students and Graham and myself in front of, we drove around Tibet for about a week in a small church bus. And this is a location of our site called Lake Yamdrok. The reason I'm showing this broken hammer below is because I'm going to use it to describe a couple aspects of object-oriented ontology, which more specifically address this concept of reality, which is an interesting thing now, and also an interesting thing for how I believe architects should think about the profession moving forward. But before you see a hammer. And what is interesting about object-oriented ontology is that it says, yes, this hammer is an object. This object has qualities that you can sense. You know that the top is metal. You know that the shaft is wood. You can lift up the weight. So the object is real and it exists, but it is surrounded by qualities, some of which you have access to, some of which you do not have access to. So you have access to what you know about this, that it's metal and that this is wood and it's certain weight. You don't have access to maybe where it was manufactured, although you could find that out. So what he calls this is an object withdrawing into itself. So the hammer has qualities which you know. The hammer has qualities which you don't know, which you could figure out. And then the hammer has qualities which you could never know. So these are called three aesthetic distances, which I've written about in a few different books, but I'm not going to go into detail. And why I think this is relevant to architecture is because the world is defined by these three aesthetic relationships. You look at a thing and you understand aspects of it. You look at a thing and you don't understand aspects of it, but you could research them and understand those aspects. Or you see a thing and you are forbidden access to aspects of it. There are simply aspects of it you will never know. So for instance, this mundane hammer is formed of carbon, which forms the steel. Carbon, as with all higher order elements, is only formed in the supernova of dying stars that are about 10 times larger than our sun. So this hammer is comprised significantly of molecules that were formed sometime between 4 billion and 13 billion years ago in the crucible of a dying star, which probably became a neutron star and collided with another neutron star and scattered these heavy elements out into the universe. So it makes every object that you come in contact with a little more interesting, right? And that's an important part of what I'm going to talk about in architecture, this notion of curiosity. This idea that the architecture I'm interested in is the architecture that generates curiosity about the aspects of reality we don't know, rather than reinforces the aspects of reality that we already know, right? So when we see Santiago Calatrava design a transit center like he did in New York City and designs it to look like a bird, that is not of particular interesting to me because I already know what a bird looks like. Or if an architect uses historic references, that's really not of interest to me because I already know the history of architecture. I like architecture that alludes to aspects of reality that we are not sure of, that provokes my curiosity and asks me to go deeper into the building, why the way it is, and in a sense, captivate your, let's say, senses of curiosity so that architecture isn't something which we encounter superficially. And I think this is architecture's great hope in the digital world, is this the one thing that can't be digitized. You can't digitize three-dimensional space and the sense of being in a room such as you are right now. So based on what I've just told you, your apartment should have gotten a lot more interesting, if you ask what aspects of that flower pot you have access to and what you don't. It adds an element of curiosity, and some philosophers call it the remystification of the world, not through religion, but through science, which is also an interesting divide we're talking about these days. Now, as it turns out, in my research, architecture has always had a relationship with reality, and in particular with how to understand those realities and the human incapacity to directly understand those realities. So I'm just going to give three quick examples. The first example is the Parthenon in Athens. I'm sure you're all aware of from your history classes. The Parthenon, as many of you probably know from these classes, doesn't have a straight line in the entire structure. The stylobate, which is the base, is entirely curved. The columns splay out. The entire floor is basically like the surface of a basketball, gently curved in multiple directions. These are all known as optical corrections or Periclean refinements. The reason the Greeks did this was that when they built small temples, they looked correct. But when they started to build larger temples, they realized that the eye distorts reality, so it looked like the temples were, in a sense, splaying outward and were about to, in a sense, fall down. They didn't look sturdy. So the Greeks took it upon themselves to correct the architecture to better reflect the reality which they thought existed in the temple. That is to say, their eyes were incapable of seeing reality as what it was, so they changed the design of the temple to better reflect the reality that they knew to exist. This was also the case in Roman, Vitruvian, Augustan Rome. Vitruvius was Augustus's architect, wrote what we know as the first treatise on architectural theory, called his 10 Books of Architecture. And what's very interesting is he goes through this entire book, tells you about the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, how you have to follow all of these rules. You get your cement from here, you lay out cities like this. It's very prescriptive. It's like a recipe book for architecture and urban planning. And then he has this weird segment in it that says, but as we all know, the human eye is fallible. So when you look through a river as you're rowing, the oar will look broken through the water because the eye is imperfect. So I couldn't find an image of an oar breaking in the water, but this pencil in a cup of water illustrates the same point. That the eye, through the refraction in the water, makes it appear as if this pencil is broken in half when it's not broken in half. So Vitruvius also here realizing the eye is fallible when it comes to understanding this ontological nature of reality, because we know the pencil isn't broken. Why does it look broken? So essentially he says you have to follow all of these rules in architecture unless something looks a little bit off, in which case it's the architect's responsibility to correct it. It's the ultimate caveat in architectural theory. If we look 1400 years or so later, Brunelleschi in the Renaissance around 1419 to 1421 conducts an infamous experiment in front of the baptistry in the Duomo that he was working on at the time, where he takes a series of mirrors and a painting of the baptistry and tries to understand how his eye is calculating these perspective lines and how to understand the relationship between representation not only in the X and Y direction, but in the Z direction that moves backwards. So what Brunelleschi was trying to do was understand how reality would look before it was built. And architecture has historically called this perspectival drawing. Its sole purpose is one of two things: to produce a sense of reality in a two-dimensional space that appears as a three-dimensional reality, or to collapse the three-dimensional reality into a two-dimensional space, which is how it was used in painting originally by Masaccio. Now, this is interesting because if you look at the time that followed, this on the left is an image from 1250, a book, a religious book that contained some writings on geometry. And it was how in 1250 a geometer understand the idea of a cylinder. A cylinder was two circles at the top and bottom and some lines that connected them. But it wasn't important that the cylinder look real as it looked in real life, because it wasn't humans' job to understand reality. It was God's job to understand reality. So there was no desire to paint things as they looked realistically to humans, because that was the purview of God to understand things. If humans wanted to understand things, they went through God. They didn't go directly through representation. 1250 is a cylinder on the left. 1450 is a drawing by Uccello on the right, which is the world's first wireframe. And you can see how in 2 centuries, the human understanding of geometry, perception, depth, and the kind of reality of form was, in a sense, supercharged. On the lower left, you see an image of Florence before the Duomo was built, probably painted around 1200, 1300. Afterward, on the right, you see this famous map called the Map in Chains, which was painted in 1480, and you can see how it includes the Duomo. So in between those two images of Florence, you see on the left that it is Florence. You recognize it because of the baptistry and Palazzo Vecchio and some of the buildings, but there's no effort made to make it appear as Florence really appears from a distant hill. Whereas on the right, it's a much better capture of the realism of what Florence looked like to the human eye. So my work can be kind of seen as juggling these ideas within philosophy, history, and architectural design. And the kind of writing that I do is generally, it does its best to intertwine these. Sometimes it errs a little bit on the more philosophical and political. Sometimes it puts it all together, as in the most recent monograph on our work. So it's a really great time to read these days. All of these are available on Amazon. I'll make huge amounts of money, at least like a fifth of a cent for each one you buy. So I really appreciate your support. Again, no laughter, just jokes, dead on arrival. That's right, I'm laughing inside, and my dog, I'll pretend he's laughing. So in our office, we have a couple trajectories of architectural projects. It's the big question: how do you put these ideas into architectural practice? The trajectories are either really through technology or through form. The ones we've had better luck building are through technology, in that they ask us to challenge certain things that we take for granted. For instance, the upper two images are a pavilion I did for the Coachella Music Festival for H&M, the fashion company. And in it, we used a lot of interactive technologies, just showing one here where there was a wall where if you pushed it, it would change color. So something like a wall is reconsidered to be something that isn't static and boring and structural, but something that is not structural, is interactive, supple, and more about an aesthetic effect than the division of space. We collaborated in the same pavilion with Oculus Rift. You see an image of a thing in the lower left where we had hanging an H&M dress with a certain pattern on it. We took the pattern on that dress and blew it up and wallpapered a small room with an enlarged version of the pattern on that dress. And then we microscopically scanned the fabric structure of that dress, and you could walk across the fabric in Oculus Rift. So we were trying to look at the realities of something like a dress as a full dress, as an enlarged pattern, and as a micro walking across the surface of the fabric to show that the dress had qualities which were removed, but we could access them. The project in the center was a store we built for Diesel in Williamsburg a few years ago. On the far lower right is an image of a project we built for Intel Corporation, a series of interactive pavilions that were built in Singapore, Hong Kong, San Francisco, New York, London, and Paris. We did a number of stores for Nicola Formichetti, working in collaboration with Lady Gaga. This is a store in Beijing. Well, no, sorry, this one's in Hong Kong, with all of Lady Gaga's outfits, and it had different outfits for sale mixed in among all of her clothes. All of the walls changed colors. We just finished, or about to finish, this project, which is the largest virtual reality center in the Western Hemisphere. It's called Virtual Reality World, and it's in New York, about 10,000 square feet on 3 floors, not far from the Empire State Building. So this project has this projection map centered object, which through the projection mapping allows it to change its sensibilities of reality. And it's just a really like super highly charged, color changing projection environment that's constantly changing and constantly challenging the idea that architecture is this stable thing of one material. We did another project in New York for Nicola Formichetti, again with Lady Gaga, all of her outfits here. It was almost impossible to photograph because it was about 1,000 different mirrored facets. The photographer from Vogue told me it was the most beautiful retail space she had ever been in, but after 3.5 hours of trying to photograph it, she couldn't get a single useful photograph because the flash just, completely destroyed and obliterated the image. So this is actually kind of a Photoshop composite image. It's tuned up and down to show you more or less what it looked like. These are some images. It photographed a little bit better with some of the smoky effects that happened in it, but you can see the reflections of the space. There was robotic lighting, all sorts of different interactive technologies in here. And I'm going to show you a video of that space just because I like showing things occupied, especially because it's so rare in our work. But this is one of the videos that was produced. I think this may have been the opening night of Lady Gaga's You and I video, which premiered in the space, but here you go.
Mark, just so you know, I don't think we're getting the sound. if there's sound.
Could you hear that?
No. Someone.
Sorry, am I breaking up?
Yeah.
Close it. Can you guys
hear you, but we don't hear the sound in the video if there is any.
Oh, there's no sound. Okay. Good to know.
Animation sometimes overwhelm the whole thing.
Oh, okay. Maybe we'll skip those. All right. I'll skip the animations for the remainder. Maybe show part of one. So the next kind of body of work is this work that came out of some of those discussions with Graham Harman about the nature of objects, how we pull meaning from them and identity. So just as an experiment, we started combining objects in ways that were meaningless, that didn't have symbolism, that didn't have a kind of underlying structure or meaning. This language became what we call kit bashing. We used it in a number of our projects, but I think it's important for me to say that this isn't how I think the world should be. This was a philosophical exercise explored through architecture, which later became used in kind of different scenarios. This was for our Helsinki Guggenheim Museum, and it was just competition. But in a sense, we used these downloaded objects to produce a kind of high resolution overload that really challenged the reading of whether or not this was architecture. It was big like architecture. It has stone like architecture, but it certainly doesn't have the forms that one would associate with architecture. So again, like that broken hammer, trying to see what aspects of the qualities of architecture would move to the foreground and which would recede. Again, not saying this is what the world should look like, but this was a kind of experiment that helped us to explore a higher resolution language that we're interested in pursuing with regards to this nature of reality. I'm going to skip the animations because they just apparently suck on Zoom. I just like this image because this is, I don't know if you know Arata Isozaki. He's a Pritzker Prize winning architect from Japan, kind of the godfather of Japanese architecture. And he gave a lecture and he included my Helsinki Guggenheim with the word weird across the front. And I just thought that was great that Arata Isozaki is giving a lecture about my work, but that he thought it was weird, which was the entire point, that it was challenging one's preconceived notions of what the limits are of form in architecture. I've done some experiments with some of my students at Yale. We have been taking this language. This is a 3D print on the left, which is about 3.5 feet tall, using this language. We decided to take a piece of it, and in collaboration with an Italian company, along with some students, I sent some students to Italy, and they CNC milled part of this out of solid Carrara marble at about 2 feet by 2 feet. So this is the same marble in the same location that Michelangelo, is where he got his marble and where he did a lot of his carving. But you can see it's just robotic carving of a giant marble chunk, this chunk here on the right, just as a kind of proof of concept. We've used this language to design for a company I'm associated with. I design a lot of the accessories for this fashion company called Nico Panda. This shows a lot of their products, from almost like kit bashed materials and colors in their backpacks to an iPhone case, which didn't go into production, some sunglasses in the lower middle, which were intended to make you look like a panda rather than just be sunglasses. And then we did a line of cosmetics on the lower left for MAC Cosmetics that were sold internationally last year. But again, just really trying to push the nature of materials and forms. Sometimes we're able to do this in greater degrees, sometimes in lesser degrees. We did it in collaboration with Nicolo Formichetti on an outfit for Lady Gaga, where the original idea was to 3D print masks of all of her fans and create of a kind of carapace of her fans that she would wear. That was vetoed by her people because someone thought it looked like death masks and that she was going to be criticized for, like, I don't know, killing her fans or something. So we ended up landing on 3D printing multiple versions of her own face and making a kind of shoulder harness out of it. So she was wearing herself. And then in the video, we did things which were impossible, like symmetrical blowing drapery in the form of these angel wings. Again, this is available online, so I won't show you the video. We're using that language now in some product design. These are some vases we're doing for a gallery. This is Yunling in my office, diligently sanding. We're doing a mix of 3D printing, but also casting these in different resins, different plastics, doing a lot of experimentation with these forms to try to get them out of the computer at different scales. So here you can see some of the full-size ones on the right, which are these pastel urethane plastic, which are rotocast into molds. This is kind of a, I don't know, early photo shoot of how some of them are coming out. We're going to do some, there's a range of about 6, and some of them are going to be electroplated with brass, like this one that has these wings on it. So again, you can see how this language is like moving through some of our projects, sometimes in really dramatic ways like this vase or the Helsinki Guggenheim, sometimes in really subtle ways like in those backpacks, which are merely using a different mix of materials and colors. We've tried them at different scales in some residential projects in New York. One here is a small residential building on Bond Street, which is designed by this cast stone, detailed cast stone facade with a large penthouse at the top. A medium-sized one, or actually a rather large one, was this project in Seattle, which was required to have all these balconies, so there's not a lot of things to do on the facade when one has to cover it with balconies. So essentially we looked at using this kind of kit bashing language as the underside of all the balconies, and in association with these growing panels of vegetation which creep up the side of the buildings. Again, trying to use this in greater and lesser degrees. We did a 102-story proposal for a skyscraper in Manhattan that the press called the Khaleesi. There's a piece in CNN that's about to come out about this and its relationship to Gothic architecture, which I'm involved in. But it was from a number of years ago, but it still seems to have this kind of life online. But you can see in this, we tried to fuse this language of the glass modern curtain wall with a kind of structuralism of almost like an industrial Gothic to produce a building which was entirely residential, still had the required glass for the views, the amount of views that read the real estate calculations. It's not super important, but in glass towers like the one Christian Portzum Park did here in Manhattan, it's all glass, which is actually a little bit problematic because you get too much light. There's a 100-story one that was done by Raphael Vignoli, which has punched windows, which by using more opacity, the apartments are actually a little bit nicer. And so this has the amount of glass that does, but instead of doing punched openings, it does a full curtain wall that's structurally clad with these different forms from this language. We collaborated with a concept artist out of Hollywood named Patrick Fallwetter to help us imagine some of the other aspects of these spaces, like the entrance on the left and the main lobby on the right. And I will skip that. So Stephen, renderings just don't, animations just don't really work at all? Or is it just the sound? Are they really choppy? You're muted.
Sorry, they can work. It's just they tend to, if they're big ones, they will shut down your system.
I see. I'm just going to skip
We
it.
haven't gotten the sound, so I don't know what's wrong with the sound on your end. But,
just know that, they're brilliant.
But if you want to play some, you can try it and see what happens. And the worst that happens is you get tossed out and then you have to come back on.
That's all right. You can find them on our website, but they're amazing and wonderful and spectacular. I'm learning how to talk about my work as if I were the president. So the next project here we were asked to do by New York Magazine. They asked a number of architects, including myself and Diller and Scafidio and Norman Foster and Associates, and two others. But I like to tell people that they got the big three, like my office, Norman Foster, and Diller and Scofidio, as a joke. I mean, my office is 5 people usually. So, anyways, the brief was to imagine the future of New York City in 50 years, and I think we maybe overshot the mark a little bit. Diller and Scofidio did a series of roof gardens. Norman Foster's office extended Madison Square to include more pedestrian areas. Our office looked at the future of flooding and realized that the East River, which is actually an estuary, tidal estuary, was the most problematic of Manhattan because if it flooded, it would wipe out all of these parts of Manhattan in blue, which is a significant amount. So instead of covering all of Manhattan with barriers, we just decided to drain the East River and make a fertile landscape with park and farmland out of it. And I don't know, we were really trying to think big, and like I said, maybe we overshot the mark. But what's interesting about it is that I get invited to like conferences by aquatic engineers all the time now. Like I have some sort of insight in the future of dam design, but we were just intended to provide a provocation where infrastructural moves can become like massive public moves, that it doesn't need to be like the current scheme, which is just building a little U-shaped wall around the tip of Manhattan to protect Wall Street, but a kind of epic thinking in architecture might reveal other possible solutions. Some things of which the United States has done in the past, like the epic projects of the Tennessee Valley Authority, for one. But these are some of the different views, and this was all featured in New York Magazine. We developed a language for these vertical parks, which would take people from the city down through these particular areas and slopes and to this parkland below. But these are also these massive geothermal vents for geothermal technology, which was intended to power the city. So this language which we worked on was a kind of language vertical circulation that went around things like vertical greenery, or in this case, we would have water trickle out of a fountain in the summer months, and then when it froze, it would just make a giant icicle that you would kind of walk around. And that's what's shown on the left. You can see the stairs here. But there's always little areas to kind of walk out farther and look back at these things. And in a sense, it wasn't a direct circulation. It was intended to be what they call in the École des Beaux-Arts a marche, which is a kind of flowing experiential circulation, although in this scenario writ at the urban scale. I think I left a couple projects in here which I would just breeze through. This was one for a subterranean museum in Peru, which used this language to bring people down into a courtyard and into a vaulted structure. We did a project that was trying to use this language with fractals for the Lithuanian Center for Science and Innovation. There's an animation that I will skip, but it's the development of a fractal sponge that we resampled to get different layers of mathematical fractals, which we in turn pushed together to show different layers of resolution in the same building from the same viewpoint. This was the main interior atrium, which has almost a kind of brutalist quality about it, which I think may come from my time spent in Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building at Yale, where, as I mentioned, I've spent 20 years of my life. But it does this brutalism with a kind of fine-grained stretching of mathematic, recursive geometries into this form, which is almost like, I think someone wrote about it as like hyper Scarpa-esque, which I'll take. But again, this idea of resolution, making you read the architecture at multiple layers of reality, that there's something to understand from this position and a closer position and a closer position, and that position isn't always visible all at the same time. This is an idea that comes out of philosophy in Edmund Burke and Aristotle, that if an object is sufficiently detailed and large, you can't comprehend it with your mind, which is why I'm not really against, but I have a debate with people like Michael Meredith, who I know lectured previously about his ideas of low resolution, because I think they're too easily consumable and turn architecture into like an Instagram flip. Where my ambitions in architecture is to make architecture the opposite of consumable, the generator of curiosity, and something which you can't dismiss with a quick, easy initial understanding, which I believe low resolution architecture, as he's promoting it, does. This is another project in Lithuania for the Kirlionis Concert Hall. I should mention in both these Lithuania projects, we got honorable mentions, not enough to crack the top three, but getting a little bit closer to building, which is a nice feel. This was built on the waterfront overlooking the city of Kaunas, which is a very beautiful city. And we use this sets of geometry to array aspects of the program around this large public space, which had a series of ramps and balconies which led down to the lower promenade. The main building was a concert hall. There's a tendency in concert hall design, which I've become a little bit more familiar with. I taught a studio with Frank Gehry a number of years ago at Yale, and the project was for a concert hall. So I learned quite a bit about him. But one trend is that they're increasingly becoming transparent on the facade, because there's this idea if you look in and see people in the lobby that somehow it's more democratic or you have more access to it. And I've always thought of this as a kind of falsehood. I don't think there's any sense of democracy in looking at rich people drinking wine before they go in and see a fantastic show. So I question the political motivations of that aspect, and instead am more interested in producing a more theatrical experience. So the interior of the concert hall is completely removed from the exterior. There's no hint of what happens on the interior in the exterior. That's actually an idea that comes from Charles Garnier in his design for the Paris Opera House. He designed this large, fantastic, over-the-top lobby, super ornamental. So you wouldn't go from the street into the opera house, which is how you did it historically. You would go from the street into a theatrical lobby into the opera house. His idea was that spending time in the lobby prepared one to receive theater, that it was a kind of recalibration of your mind to receive a type of fictional reality, which is theater. So I would say our design, this is the interior. In Disney Hall, Frank Gehry did this really wonderful thing where he put the organ up as this ornamental object in the back of the concert hall. So we tried a similar thing, but hung it from the ceiling almost as a giant chandelier. And you can see the kind of air pipes which contour, I would say, maybe elegantly and excessively towards this centralized organ which hangs down above the choir or symphony below. Kind of much smaller scale project is a project which is still going forward for a small private library and guest house in Shropshire, England. It's on the estate of this estate called Penkridge Hall. This building, the original hall, was built in 1532, and this site here was actually the site of a Templar chapel in the 12th century. So there's a lot of historic organizations with their eye on this project, and they have to approve it. So the kind of, there's two interesting stories about it. One, I asked the owner, like, how did you get my name, or what, why did you choose me for this project? And he said that he spent a bunch of time and chose his 5 favorite architects in the world, and was looking at them all, and I was like, why did you choose me? And he was like, well, you were the only one that wasn't dead. So that's a good way to get a project. But he had some people like, I think like Hector Guimard and Frank Lloyd Wright on his list. So nice to be included among those. But the brief was very strange. The project had to look chapel-y, but be contemporary and be a library. So it has all these kind of conflicting signals. So what we did was try to reread some of the diagonal languages of the Tudor, which you can see here in the lower right, mixed with the kind of Gothic aspects of certain local area chapels and Templar chapels, to do a building which combined qualities, again, qualities that are Gothic and contemporary and residential, without the building being Gothic, entirely residential, or seeming like it was a kind of Gothic reenactment. This is just a cutaway. It's a very small project. We're looking at different patterns now, and this was one of the early sketches of the relationship between the interior and the exterior. The contractor or architect of record had proposed casting these out of this really high-grade concrete called tactile in CNC milled form. So they're just panels which stack on top of a concrete frame. A sister project to that was a similarly programmed one in Calais, which used a much higher fine level of detail because it was more like a folly in a garden and didn't have the historic baggage that the English one did. So this project is north of Calais, not going to be built, but use these kind of filigree languages again with the cast tactile concrete. But it's really just a kitchen on the lower floor. You come up some stairs to a small living area. There is a bedroom in the back and a bathroom. It's intended as a guest house for a much larger chalet. As I look on the screen, I can see many of you currently occupying that background, so that's nice to see. Another residential project here is one that was buried deep in Canadian forest, so couldn't be delicate. So we tried to use this language to generate something which was the opposite of delicate, which was almost like pre-made as a ruin, which could deteriorate over time with no maintenance and still retain its architectural qualities. So here you see one of the early sketches of what we did, how we thought this thing might look in 50 years. And that was how we wanted it to look in 50 years. Not something fragile and delicate, but something tough and thick. So we developed these ledges for plant growth, 2 feet thick of masonry, bronze window frames. Bronze is the most, let's say, environmentally robust material on Earth. It'll be the last thing that disintegrates once we're all gone. We add this kind of ornamental strips to provide a foothold for vines to grow up the sides. And then the interior was these large folded windows. It was one large open space. This is a kitchen, which was kind of the Flintstones looking kitchen, but you can see that detail. And indeed, some of the greenery comes inside in these massive planters and a little dipping pool towards the back. And then the last project I'm going to show is one in a desert location in the Middle East. I can't talk about the details, but they're not super important for describing the project. But the project, we had to be flown in a helicopter around because it's not really accessible by the ground, although we did go there with a number of SUVs. So I took a number of trips to the Middle East, to the middle of the desert, and we had this idea that as you approach in a sand buggy or helicopter, which is really the only way you can get there, there would be these key points that you see along the way. So it wasn't just revealed as this big building in the desert, but it was kind of extended over time, like slowly revealed the relationship between the architecture and the environment, which were, as you will see, very tightly knit. The plan is pretty complicated. It's not something I'm going to go through in depth, but the idea was to see the center core as you went through and not see the rooms. And then the rooms were all focused towards different aspects of the landscape. So whenever you were in a room, you were never looking at architecture. You were always looking at an unobstructed view of the desert. So this is one of the first views you would get, kind of overhead of the centralized space with the restaurants, reception, pool areas, a kind of garden area. It's a very high-end resort. This is a cutaway that we collaborated on an environmental engineering firm called TransSolar with, that had a lot of environmental technologies about pools at different temperatures that were made from refiltered water. There was what's called a lunar radiator, which takes air conditioning heat and re-emits it into the night sky through this large lattice structure. There were towers which were for observation, but also for water filtration, because there was literally no source of fresh water, so the water had to be very sparingly used. But the design kind of took us in a new direction, that we started using artificial intelligence, and we started taking various patterns from historic points in the region, and the patterns, the architecture, the fashion, the jewelry, and started using AI software to blend these patterns into what we call deep three-dimensional facades. So these are some of the patterns which were the like primitives that we were working with the AI to generate these fusions of different patterns. So one of these patterns might have qualities of one civilization, qualities of another civilization, in some of our own hand manipulation, but it wouldn't be a reuse of a pattern in a kind of postmodern way. It was using artificial intelligence as a way to create fused mutations in form that weren't possible with the human mind, at least for us. And some of the images, which I'll just flip through, show that sequential journey of this is an observation in water tower that you see has a kind of formal language on the side that gets much more delicate at the top. As you're in the observation tower, you see it more at the top. This is a type of arcade which looks out over the desert and the main dipping pool that uses this AI language. That this one emerged from the combination of different historic alphabets on the site to create this alphabet-ish barrel vault, which is kind of leafed in a brassy material, which is very much part of the history of this area. Some of the areas were highly detailed, so the most public areas were the most detailed, and then the rooms had almost no detail. This is the design of a quarter of this, which was a kind of astronomical structure where guests could go and look at the night sky. Because it's a vast desert, there's no light pollution. One of the best places in the world to look at stars. But it was also an area where we wanted to really use this AI three-dimensional language and do something really intricate and important. So this is that, like I said, a kind of this section right here, and you can see the intricacy, which is slightly repeating, so it could be made out of repeating elements, likely out of terracotta. There were some more robust areas on the site. This was a prayer room, like farther in the desert, so it had to be less delicate. It had more, it needed more protection. It needed to be more like sturdy, and we had the idea that this would weather and kind of rot and deteriorate in a very beautiful way. Some areas on a kind of second stage of that project were water filtration and observation towers associated with a different cultural site nearby, and these are some studies for that. They're a little bit cleaner language because they're an area which isn't quite so brutal in terms of the weather and wind and environment, but it's kind of a delicate slipping of these geometries which are actually derived from, again, different mixed aspects of these cultural artifacts, mostly jewelry, but don't refer to the jewelry literally. The rooms were mostly kind of tucked away in between these little rock formations. They don't mimic the rock, but as I mentioned before, the rooms themselves were, for the most part, devoid of detail, and we tried to build the rooms into the rocky areas and use a kind of rocky finished concrete. So the real star of the show is the view, and your kind of view isn't detracted from anything in the room, but the room is still highly, let's say, aesthetically charged by virtue of how we treated these really colorful rock formations. This is a 3D model, I'm not a 3D, a physical model of the entire complex. All of these little buildings on this CNC milled base, which you can see weaves through this entire rocky formation. These were all 3D printed in solid brass, so it's a kind of really intricate, not inexpensive, but kind of blingy model. But it really helped us to convey that kind of quality of almost like a jewelry-like intensity within this harsh environment. And then some areas like the restaurant were embedded deep in these rocks. So you would get through the other direction and come out here, have an unobstructed view of the desert. Back here you see that little astronomical tower. This shows the kind of like grand opening, one of the entrances, which is more ceremonial, which has crashing water, so the cooling sounds of water. and would be used until about noon, in which case the sun would make this area unusable. But the main public drop-off was this area where we had a kind of cube-like structure with this, again, AI layered pattern language, which refers to these histories of the site without being dialectical or direct, and use these bent channel glass forms, which would have water trickling down them very delicately, which gives you certain effects in these inner corridors. So there are multiple ways to enter this reception area. One is through an air-conditioned space. One is through this little very shallow pool with the sound of water kind of providing a cooling sensation, but also in that idea of Charles Garnier preparing you to enter this new type of environment. And in this part of the world, you always need a separate VIP entrance. So this was the VIP entrance. And then the last slide is once you enter this space, you're in this kind of green, lush, highly detailed area that again uses this language, but at a much finer scale. And this we were proposing to collaborate with a company called Bizaza Tile, where if you give them a pattern, they literally have a robotic arm that 3D places different colors, so you can get these highly detailed, highly customized quarter-inch by quarter-inch tile patterns, which we then inlaid with different CNC brass and bronze materials to produce this kind of kaleidoscopic first impression of the site. And then you can see the receptionist here with all the reception materials hidden down this corridor, like photocopiers and file cabinets and stuff. But we wanted this first impression to be a real, like, kind of jolt to the system that would just reconfigure your sense of where you were and where you were about to spend the next few weeks. So I think that puts us at just about an hour. Sorry, that was an unrelated slide. And I guess there's some questions and answers to this, Stephen. Okay,
We're going to have lots of questions, definitely.
I prefer compliments, but questions are okay.
And we'll start with compliments. We'll move to questions. Maybe unshare. We did find out during the event that when you share your screen, if you click a little button called Share Computer Sound.
Always learning.
Yeah, they're online, so I guess people can find it.
Well, all of these videos are available on the website. They're, I mean,